Resident Evil 9 has certainly gotten a lot of attention in 2024, with the copious amount of leaks and rumors hitting the title, plus the confirmation of Koshi Nakanishi, the director of Resident Evil 7, returning to direct Resident Evil 9. But although we are yet to hear about that game in an official capacity, there are a bunch of other Resident Evil games in development, including more remakes. Capcom, exactly a year ago in December of 2023, confirmed that they are developing more remakes in the nearly 30-year-old Resident Evil franchise. As much as we're excited for the upcoming reveal of Resident Evil 9, it has to be said that these last several Resident Evil remakes are some of the best-selling games in the entire series, and we all know that Capcom, heck, any other developer for that matter, likes to see that money hit the bank, so this isn't all that surprising. With that said, let's first take a look at what Capcom recently said about the future of their remakes before discussing which remakes are likely to follow next. Are you interested in more Resident Evil remakes? Chainsaw parry that like button and comment below which Resident Evil game you'd like to see get remade next, and join me as we dive into what are likely the very next Resident Evil games to get remade. At a PlayStation Partner Awards event in Japan nearly a year ago, Resident Evil 4 Remake game director Yasuhiro Anpo announced that Capcom is committed to remaking more games from their Resident Evil franchise. "We've released 3 remakes so far," remarked Anpo, "and they have all been received very well. Since it allows a modern audience to play these games, it is something I am happy to do as someone who loves these older games, and we want to continue doing more." He continues further with, "What game we will remake in the future is something that we would like to announce in the future, so please look forward to it." So we all know that more remakes are on the way, but exactly which remake is going to make it out first? Well, the old but still excellent RE1 got a remake, but as for the modern RE Engine games, RE2, 3, and 4 each got remakes, so that would mean Resident Evil 5 would be next if solely looking at it chronologically. While Resident Evil 5 is absolutely likely to get remade eventually, many Resident Evil fans, including myself, argue that a remake of Resident Evil 5 is better saved for a later date, after some crucially important earlier games get remade first. The most obvious of the earlier titles, and by far the most requested of the bunch, is without a doubt Resident Evil Code Veronica, originally released on the Sega Dreamcast in 2000 before being re-released as a slightly more enhanced version on the PS2 the following year. As a fan of Code Veronica back in the day when it came out, I can verify that this game absolutely deserves a remake, not only because of its outdated gameplay and presentation, but also due to its narrative. Interestingly enough, longtime series insider and leaker with varying degrees of accuracy, Dusk Golem, claimed earlier in 2024 that Code Veronica is indeed getting a remake. We'll get into that more in just a bit. When remaking games in a popular franchise like Resident Evil, throwing out random remakes left and right is not the way to go about it. It seems like recently Capcom was deliberate in following the series chronologically when it started with remaking RE2, as that remake followed up with Resident Evil 3 and the more recent Resident Evil 4 getting remade. Jumping straight into Resident Evil 5, while making sense from the chronological standpoint, would disregard the millions of newer players that have been introduced to the franchise from these more recent remakes, as those who completed Resident Evil 4 Remake are left wondering who the heck this sharp-dressed man in shades is. Longtime Resident Evil fans know that this man is none other than Albert Wesker, the series' biggest standout villain, and by jumping straight into Resident Evil 5, the transition would not properly set up newer players, nor the established lore from these recent remakes to accommodate the massive and important role that Wesker serves in the 5th title. That's why Code Veronica absolutely makes sense here in a potential remake, because Wesker does serve a big role here. And not only that, we see Claire and Chris Redfield develop further after the events of the Raccoon City incident that was covered in Resident Evils 2 and 3. In one of my older videos, we looked at the supposed leak on 4chan of all places that shed light on a Code Veronica remake, fleshing out the earlier moments of the game's prologue while also adding new features of its own, like allowing players to swap between Claire Redfield and Steve Burnside at an instant. Code Veronica, like the older Resident Evil games with their fixed camera perspectives and tank controls, could absolutely benefit from a ground-up remake, featuring an over-the-shoulder perspective with revamped gameplay and controls like the recent remakes we've gotten. And this leak, yes, I will continue using quotations here to refer to it, suggests that it will be following very closely to the established gameplay we've come to know from the recent remakes. Seeing as Code Veronica not only sees Wesker get more fleshed out, we also get important story developments for Claire and Chris Redfield, of whom the latter is one of the primary protagonists of Resident Evil 5. This just makes much more sense for Code Veronica to get remade first before Resident Evil 5. And let's just hope that Capcom has been paying attention to all the fans out there who echo these sentiments. It is certainly encouraging that Dusk Golem has reported that Code Veronica is indeed one of the games getting a remake, and if his post in May turns out to be true, then we are in for a real treat, as the development team that brought us the fantastic Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4 remakes is said to be hard at work on this remake of Code Veronica. Fingers crossed this is truly happening, as this is easily the most requested remake of the bunch, and seeing this awesome classic reborn in the RE engine, hopefully with VR functionality and more, would be incredible to see. Other games up for consideration for remakes are but two titles, Resident Evil 0 and the original Resident Evil. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because while most people are totally cool with seeing RE0 get a remake, and rightly so, Resident Evil 1 remains the most polarizing. On the one hand, Resident Evil 1 got a remake of its own back in 2002 on the GameCube, and has since, like Code Veronica, been made available on PS4 and Xbox One, which can be played via backwards compatibility on modern hardware. Let me just briefly gush about the awesomeness of Resident Evil Remake for just a second. Maybe more. Resident Evil Remake is a phenomenal remake and is easily one of my favorite Resident Evil games to this day. It's got incredible atmosphere, much improved gameplay and graphics over the original, and establishes an absolutely essential narrative that literally sets up the entire events of the franchise, along with Resident Evil 0, of course. That said, for as much of a fan as I am of the RE1 remake, this game absolutely deserves to get a remake as well. Not only is this one of the most important games in the franchise when considering the game's narrative and characters, like the setting up of Albert Wesker and Chris Redfield before an RE5 remake, but quite frankly, the game's tank controls and gameplay are seen as outdated by many fans, including some old school RE players. I've made dozens upon dozens of Resident Evil videos on this channel, and I have heard from countless newer fans that they would love to experience Resident Evil 1, but without the fixed camera and tank controls. And well, guess what? That's enough to indicate to me that Capcom would want to tackle Resident Evil 1 again for another more modern remake, because at the end of the day, Capcom is a company, and they look at the money first before even going ahead and greenlighting a project. What other game in their repertoire would make as much money as a full-blown remake of the very first game, right? Even though polarizing, a remake of Resident Evil 1 would absolutely print money, and it would reintroduce older players to one of the most iconic settings in the franchise, while also providing newer fans of the series a fresh new perspective and introduction to a bona fide classic. Can we all say no to seeing the Spencer Mansion in the RE engine? Didn't think so. Funny enough, a remake of Resident Evil 1 was rumored earlier this year by BioDeclassified on Twitter, detailing key aspects of the game, where it is said to be quite a faithful remake of the 2002 remake. Again, none of this is confirmed, but consult this video I did going over the recent RE1 remake leaks if you're more curious about this potential project. Alright, enough about RE1 for now, but let me know your thoughts about this in the comments section, and whether you'd like to see another RE1 remake featuring the third-person perspective in the RE engine. Resident Evil 0 is another game that is often brought up in the discussion for possible remakes, and rightly so. Just like the Code Veronica remake leak from Dusk Golem, this leaker suggested that RE0 is also getting a remake alongside Code Veronica. In addition, he reported that the RE0 remake is being led by K2 and M2, teams that recently did work on the Separate Ways DLC for Resident Evil 4 Remake, and also served as support teams for the RE4 Remake project. Again, take all this with grains of salt, but considering that both RE0 and RE Code Veronica both get remakes, this will do wonders in providing clarity on Albert Wesker and the events leading up to his big role in Resident Evil 5, and will obviously present these games in a more presentable way for newer fans of the series to engage with these classics. Again, Resident Evil Evil Zero is another older game featuring fixed camera perspectives and tank controls, along with the frustrating inventory management as we guided Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen through the events leading up to the very first RE game. As previously mentioned, Wesker plays an important role here, so that's another reason why Resident Evil Zero should be considered. One common thread among the recent Resident Evil remakes is that Wesker is either barely mentioned in any of these games or is very briefly depicted. RE5 would serve as the next game to get remade should Capcom decide to remake the games chronologically after RE4 Remake, but by doing that, they disregard setting players up for Wesker's most climactic chapter that takes place in the 5th game. While Resident Evil 5 is admittedly dated when compared to the newer Resident Evil games, that game still does deserve its remake, but perhaps it being the next entry in the remake series is best saved for another time. There are still plenty of older games in the series that would greatly benefit from being remade, not just because of their dated gameplay and visuals, but because these earlier games contain essential story information that would build up appropriately to an eventual RE5 remake. So far, we've only been talking about the mainline entries in the Resident Evil series, but we absolutely shouldn't gloss over some other games that have been adored by fans over the years. Perhaps the biggest of them all is the Resident Evil Outbreak series. Having a modern take on this online cooperative RE game would no doubt be a treat and will easily be more successful than Capcom's recent attempts at competitive Resident Evil multiplayer. The RE Survivor games would be cool as cheaper downloadable titles as well. Let me know what you think about all this Resident Evil remake stuff in the comments below, and also let me know if you're getting fatigued with all these remakes and just want fresh new entries in the series. I really hope Resident Evil 9 releases next to break up these remakes, but again, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and also watch this video for an idea of everything that is in store for us in Resident Evil 9, both confirmed by Capcom themselves and from the numerous leaks and insider information. Stay tuned to the channel for more Resident Evil content, and I wish you happy holidays. I look forward to seeing you all real soon in the next one.